Entering the second week of May, Donald Trump leads Joe Biden by 0.4%, according to 683 polls tracked thus far in DDHQ and the Hills polling average. He has led in 5 out of the last 10 election surveys, while Biden has led in 4. And one poll from Quinnipiac University, showed here, has the two candidates tied in a national head-to-head contest. Now, when including independent Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the rest of the non-major party candidates, not pictured here, Trump's lead expands slightly to 1.3% according to 141 polls. The former president holds 42.3% to the sitting president Biden's 41%, and then RFK's 8.1%. But how are each of these candidates performing state by state? In order to be elected president, a candidate must secure at least 270 electoral college votes, out of the 538 up for grabs across the entire country. In today's video, I'm going to take you through the state of play in each of the key battleground states that will determine the winner of the election, offering my own personal prediction ratings ranging from safe to lean to toss-up, taking into account all of the different factors that we can use to forecast the election as accurately as possible. Please make sure to subscribe to my channel down below for more election analysis like this. And while you're at it, feel free to check out my forecasting website linked in the description at electionpredictionsofficial.com for more visibility into the heaps and heaps of data that you see on your screen here, doing all of the work behind the scenes that made me the most accurate independent forecaster of the 2020 election. Now let's start here in 2024 by filling in all of the safe states for Joe Biden, the incumbent president and presumptive Democratic nominee. Starting in the Northeast, we have the Empire State, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and Maine's 1st Congressional District. And moving down to the Mid-Atlantic region, we have New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia, or Washington, D.C. These states and districts are all projected to vote for Biden by at least 12 percentage points this November, the cutoff point between a solid and likely rating. He won each of these states by at least 15% in 2020, the highest being Vermont, 35 points, and the lowest New Jersey, 16 points. Jersey is probably going to be the likeliest among these to finish closest to likely territory again. Again, that is 12 points. It's shifted more than 2 points in favor of the GOP relative to the nation since 2012, and in a true Republican wave year, I could see it dipping closer to single digits. But given that national polling right now does show a very tight race head-to-head between Biden and Trump, I'm not expecting that to happen. Moving out of the Northeast, though, and over to Illinois, the only solid blue state, actually, not located on either the Atlantic or Pacific coast. It, like New Jersey, has actually trended right in relation to the rest of the country over the last few cycles, but it did vote for Biden by 17 points in 2020 and has not gone red since 1988. And now finally, we head out west to the Pacific Coast Democratic strongholds of Hawaii, California, Oregon, and Washington, which have also all gone blue in every presidential race since 1988, and all voted for Biden by comfortable margins in the 2020 election, ranging from D+16 in Oregon all the way up to D+29 in both California and down here in Hawaii. Now, Oregon, like New Jersey, is a state that I could see being decided by a likely margin in a very strong year for Republicans. Trump did in fact lose the state by just 11 points in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, before it trended strongly back into solid territory for Biden in 2020. So these 15 blue states plus Washington, D.C. combine for a grand total of 181 electoral votes for Joe Biden. Now this number can be interpreted as the Democratic Party's baseline, or their starting foundation that they'll be looking to build on over the next few months. There are of course several more states that lean strongly toward Biden that we'll get to here in a minute, but these are the states that I would give him a 99% chance of winning or better. And on that note, as for the safe Trump states, up here in the Mountain West region, we have Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah, All four backed the Republican nominee in 7 straight presidential elections, with Trump's 2020 margins ranging from R plus 16 in Montana to R plus 43 in Wyoming, his best margin of any state in that election, actually. And then moving down the Great Plains region now, Trump will pick up North and South Dakota, Nebraska's statewide contest, along with its 1st and 3rd congressional districts. Remember that Nebraska and Maine have split electoral vote systems, awarding 2 votes to the winner of the statewide popular vote and 1 per congressional district. The 2nd districts in both states have become competitive in recent elections, and more on that later. Former President Trump will also surely win Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and then across the deeply conservative southern states of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and South Carolina. North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida are the only competitive states in what we would generally consider to be the Deep South. Meanwhile, the border states of Kentucky and West Virginia are 2 of the strongest pro-Trump states in the nation, at R plus 26 and R plus 39, respectively. West Virginia was Trump's best state in 2016 and 2nd best in 2020. And then finally, closing out the safe states, we have Indiana, which will also go solid red. A swing state just a decade ago, it actually backed Obama in 2008, but is now backed Trump by more than 16 points in back-to-back elections. So that raises Trump up to his baseline number of 122 electoral votes. Now that is noticeably higher than Biden's initial total, even though Trump has secured 19 states so far to Biden's 13. Democrats can thank New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and California for that. They each hold more electoral votes than any of these solid Trump states and combine for a total of 115, almost hitting Trump's current total. This is simply a reflection of the 2 parties' very distinct geographic voter bases, as Democrats run up their totals in the highly populated and deep blue coastal regions, while Republicans' voter bases are more spread out across the middle of the country in states with significantly lower populations, and therefore fewer electoral votes. In fact, 6 of Trump's 19 safe states hold no more than 4 electoral votes. Tennessee and Indiana's 11 electoral votes each are actually the most of any of these safe states. That being said, this initial electoral vote advantage for Biden is going to disappear pretty quickly here once we add all of the likely states for each candidate. Likely states are those with a strong amount of lean toward a party, but where an upset may be possible if one candidate wins in landslide fashion. In other words, while safe or solid states have a better than 99% chance of backing either Biden or Trump and are therefore almost certainly landslide proof, these likely states have around an 85 to 99% chance of backing a given candidate. So starting with Trump, I'm first going to place Maine's 2nd congressional district in the likely Republican category. While Maine's statewide contest is influenced most heavily by its more urban and Democratic-friendly 1st district, which backed Biden by 23 points in 2020, the 2nd district is the most rural congressional district in the entire country and much more friendly to Republican candidates. It backed Trump by 10 points in 2016 and then 7 points in 2020. And the 2 polls surveyed here so far, as we take a look over at 538, have the former president up by 14 and 20 points in this district here so far this cycle. If I had to project the 2024 margin, I would say that a Trump win of around 9 to 11 points, somewhere in that range, is probably the most likely outcome at this point. Over in the Midwest, Ohio and Iowa will join the likely Republican category. No surprises here. I do expect them to be closer to the higher end of this category's 7 to 12% margin range than the lower end here in 2024, after backing Trump by more than 8 points in both 2016 and 2020. These are actually 2 of just 19 states to trend Republican relative to the nation since 2016, and going back even further to 2012, remember that both Iowa and Ohio voted for Obama twice, in 2008 and 2012. Iowa has actually shifted 16.5 points to the right when accounting for the national shift since 2012, the most of any state, while Ohio has seen an 11.5 point shift, the 5th strongest. And to further exemplify Republican strength here, keep in mind as well that just one Democrat has won a major statewide contest in either state since 2012, that being Sherrod Brown, an extremely popular incumbent who won re-election in a Democratic wave year in 2018. And so with those trends in mind, plus the strong polling advantage that Trump has enjoyed in both states here in the early going, as you see here, Iowa and Ohio have effectively been taken off the board for the Biden re-election campaign. They are very unlikely to spend much time or money trying to put either state in play. I would expect the margin in Iowa to be slightly more pro-Trump than in Ohio. My best guess right now is Trump wins Iowa by around 10 to 12 points and Ohio by 9 to 11 points. And then moving right along down to the southeast now in Florida, where all of the momentum is actually with the GOP. Trump won the state by a 3.4 point margin in 2020, the largest margin of victory for any presidential candidate in Florida since 2004. And it was one of just 8 states where he actually performed better than he did in 2016. And then, even more recently, in the 2022 midterm elections, Republican incumbents Governor Ron DeSantis and Senator Marco Rubio both won re-election by landslide margins, at least by Florida standards, 19% and 16% respectively. So, while Florida had previously commanded more Democratic attention and money than perhaps any other state in the 21st century, and for good reason considering it holds the active record with 8 straight elections decided by less than 6 points, that simply won't be the case in 2024. Trump currently leads Biden by exactly 10% in Decision Desk HQ's polling average, as Florida is clearly on a very slippery slope towards becoming a solidly Republican state in future elections. Now, my conservative estimate would put Trump's 2024 margin at around 6 to 7 points, but I think the range of outcomes here is actually much wider than that, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if he ends up winning by 9 or 10 points when all is said and done. Over in Texas, it'll also go down as likely Republican. The Lone Star State has not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate in almost 50 years. And in spite of growing hype that the Democratic Party would flip its 40 electoral votes at some point this decade, and thereby swing the electoral college balance completely in their favor, Trump still managed to receive 52.1% of the vote in Texas in 2020, almost identical to his 52.2% vote share in 2016. Now, his margin of lead did drop to just 5.6% against Biden in 2020, down from 9 points between Trump and Clinton in 2016, and that 2020 margin was actually the lowest of the 21st century, with Biden's 46.5% vote share being the highest for a Democrat in Texas since 1976. But it was still a disappointing showing for Democrats, all things considered, as Biden polled within 1.5 points of Trump in the final polling averages, and several forecasters actually had Texas rated as a toss-up going into election night. Now, Trump and the Republican Party at large's rapid gains among Hispanics, specifically in the Rio Grande Valley, is a major concern for the Democratic Party, and has at least temporarily put a halt to the DNC's momentum in the state, even as urban and suburban areas moved in large numbers towards Biden across the state. Many Hispanic voters in the South just abruptly left the Democratic coalition, as the Rio Grande region actually shifted more decisively towards Trump than any other region in the entire country outside of the Miami-Dade area in Florida. Democrats have been benefiting from the state's rising population of college graduates, younger voters, and minorities, but Texas is 40% Hispanic, rendering their losses among this demographic especially catastrophic in the Lone Star State. I think that Trump will ultimately hold on to Texas by a margin of around 6 to 8 points again in 2024, in my opinion. Finally, moving out of the continental US over to the state of Alaska for a second, it'll almost certainly vote Republican again in 2024. It's actually only voted Democrat once in its entire history as a state, for Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964, and that was a total landslide. But it is worth noting that the Alaska Democratic Party has run several successful statewide elections over the last 2 decades, most recently Mary Peltola's shock U.S. House victory in 2022, and Trump's 10-point margin of victory in 2020 was also Republicans' narrowest presidential margin in Alaska since 1968, as the state has now trended 3.5 points towards Democrats relative to the nation since 2012. Now, obviously, Alaska is in more ways than one the most unique state in the US, and that uniqueness does extend to its politics as well, with a substantial appetite for third-party bids and a history of successful write-in campaigns as well, plus the use of ranked choice voting. Alaska's demographic profile is also much closer to that of a swing state than that of a strong Republican state, as it's actually quite racially diverse and ranks 28th in proportion of residents with a college degree. Because of all these competing dynamics, it's generally pretty difficult to predict exact margins in Alaska, but right now I would expect the margin to probably end up somewhere around what it was in 2020, a 10 to 12 point margin favoring Trump again this November. All right, now that completes the likely Republican states for Trump. As I had hinted at earlier, they have completely evaporated Biden's initial electoral vote advantage, raising Trump's total all the way up to 219 electoral college votes now, just 51 votes shy of the magic number, 270. Now, while the earlier total of 122 votes from his safe state total may represent his absolute minimum, I would say that Trump still has a better than 90% chance of winning at least 219 electoral votes, as each of these likely states that he carried in 2020 are again very, very likely to go into his column again here this November. Now, as for Democrats, we'll add a few likely states to President Joe Biden's tally as well. Starting up in Maine, we've already labeled the 1st district as safety and the 2nd district as likely R. But we'll now be marking the statewide contest as likely D, awarding 2 electoral votes to Biden. Now, Maine has voted blue in 8 straight elections, most recently by 9 points in 2020. Statewide results here do tend to lean left due to the ideological alignment of its more urban and very well-educated 1st district that mirrors the rest of the solidly blue New England states. Though statewide, because of the 2nd district, it does tend to be more competitive, as the 2nd district is much more rural and less educated. Maine's population is also notably the least racially diverse, and actually the oldest in terms of senior population as well in the entire country, which also helps Republicans be more competitive, as white voters and older voters do tend to be demographics that lean more conservative. Regardless, though, I do expect Biden to hold Maine in the Democratic corner by a margin of around 7 to 8 points here in 2024. Down in the Commonwealth of Virginia now, 13 electoral votes here will be added to Biden's tally as a likely Dem state. Virginia went from Clinton plus 5 in 2016 to Biden plus 10 in 2020, the 15th strongest pro-Democrat swing of any state in the country. Biden did become the first Democrat to carry Virginia by a double-digit margin since FDR in 1944, thanks to the diversification of Northern Virginia, as well as sliding suburban support for Trump in that election, allowing for Biden to win this once key battleground state without actively campaigning in it. Virginia had actually been a reliably Republican state for decades, backing the GOP nominee in 13 of 14 presidential elections held between 1952 and 2004. But following Barack Obama's breakthrough in 2008, it has now gone blue in 4 straight races. And outside of Glenn Youngkin's narrow off-year governor election victory in 2021, Republicans have not won a major statewide election in the Commonwealth since 2009. It's also worth noting that the national environment for Youngkin's victory in 2021 was extremely sour on Democrats, and he still only won by 2 points. Realistically, the Biden campaign will again not have to spend that much time in Virginia for them to still win it by at least 8 points, I would say. They simply have bigger fish to fry. Shifting back out west, though, both Colorado and New Mexico both go down as the likely Democrat here ahead of the 2024 election. The results in these geographic neighbors have closely mirrored each other for some time now, though 2020 actually notably marked the first time since 1968 that New Mexico voted to the right of Colorado. It backed Biden by 11 points compared to 13.5 points in Colorado. Both Colorado and New Mexico narrowly voted for George Bush in 2004 and have since backed Democratic candidates by margins of around 5 to 12 points in every election since then. Colorado's shift in favor of Biden from 2016 to 2020, from Clinton plus 5 to Biden plus 13.5, was the second most of any states. And so the fact that New Mexico is now generally considered to be less Democratic than Colorado can largely be attributed to its demographic profile. It is the 12th least educated state in the country in terms of proportion of residents with a college degree at 30%, which is the lowest of any Biden-won states besides battleground Nevada. And New Mexico is also the 15th most rural, which ranks behind only Vermont and Maine up here in the Northeast among the least urban Democratic states. It's also the only majority Hispanic state in the US, and so if Republicans continue to gain ground with Hispanic voters, as we discussed over here in Texas, that could potentially make up some of their deficit here, at least enough for me to project that it will remain in likely D territory, around a D+7 to D+9 margin. Now, those 4 states bring Joe Biden's electoral college vote tally up to 211. He still trails Trump at 219 in the race to 270. That is, though, an extremely narrow margin of just 8 electoral votes separating the two candidates right now, reflecting how competitive the electoral college landscape is expected to be here in 2024, with just 108 electoral votes remaining in the 9 states that we have yet to assign a rating to. Now, these are the 9 states that I expect to be the most actively campaigned in this cycle, and ultimately end up being the 9 closest states once all of the votes are counted, just as they were in 2020, for that matter. Obviously, those margins will still vary from state to state, with some being demonstrably more competitive than others, based on available polling data, previous results, trends, betting markets, but also just based on how the Biden and Trump campaigns are focusing their energy and resources here in the early going. So with that said, before we can get to those 6 most competitive states, let's first label Minnesota as lean Democrat, Nebraska's 2nd congressional district as leaning toward Biden, and then New Hampshire as well. And as for Donald Trump, we can label North Carolina as leaning Republican. The electoral vote distributions here almost cancel out, with 14 more electoral votes added to Biden's total, raising him to 226, and 16 from North Carolina, raising Trump up to 235. Now, the states of Minnesota and New Hampshire have followed a very similar trend over the last decade. They both backed Obama by more than 5 points in 2012, and then narrowed significantly in 2016 as Clinton just barely held both states by 1.5% in Minnesota and 0.3% in New Hampshire, before then shifting back strongly in favor of Biden in 2020 by 7-point margins each. Minnesota, surprisingly, actually holds the longest active streak of voting for Democratic presidential candidates at 12 straight elections, while New Hampshire voted Republican most recently in 2000. It has now gone blue in 5 straight elections, but it does consistently rank as the most competitive state in the Northeast. In 2016, for example, Donald Trump came less than 3,000 votes from defeating Hillary Clinton. Looking ahead to November of 2024, though, Joe Biden currently leads Trump by 3.4% based on 9 polls surveyed in Minnesota, according to DDHQ and The Hill, and by exactly 4 points based on 10 polls in the New Hampshire polling average. Ultimately, I expect that both states will go to Biden by around 4 to 6 points, depending, of course, on whether Biden can get his approval rating to tick up a few points before the election. As for Nebraska's 2nd district, recent attempts from Trump allies to get rid of Nebraska's split electoral vote system failed in the state legislature, which means that Biden will again have another opportunity to siphon an electoral vote off of Trump in a deep red state. This Omaha-based 2nd district is rapidly Dem trending, going from Romney +8 to Trump +2, and then Biden +7 in 2020. The district's lines were drawn to be slightly more favorable to Republicans following the 2020 census, but it's still leaning heavily in favor of Biden. Betting odds give him an 80% chance of holding its lone electoral vote, and most major forecasters have it down as lean or even likely D. As for Trump, down here in the Tar Heel state, North Carolina has now voted Republican in 3 straight presidential contests since Barack Obama's 2008 victory, and the GOP has simultaneously won 5 consecutive U.S. Senate races since then as well. Notably, though, in both cases, all 8 of those federal elections were decided by less than 5 points, as North Carolina has established itself as a perennial purple state in major statewide races. Most recently, Trump carried North Carolina by just 1.4% in 2020, after securing the state by 3.7% in 2016. Now here in 2024, Trump is leading Biden by an average of 4.8% based on 31 polls, added to DDHQ and the Hill's polling average. He has led in every single poll taken here in North Carolina, going all the way back to last March. Though again, that overall advantage of 4.8% has narrowed after peaking at around 8 to 10 points earlier this year. Ultimately, going back to the map, I think we are likely to see Trump carry North Carolina this November by a similar margin to his 2016 win, around 3 to 4 points. Maybe he'll even push 5 in a very good environment for him. Cool, now with those 4 classifications out of the way, we can finally dive into the 6 states that will matter more than any other in the race to 270. Joe Biden carried all 6 of these states by less than 3 percentage points in the 2020 election, after Trump had carried them all except for Nevada in 2016. Mathematically speaking, if Trump manages to flip back into his column any 4 out of these 6 states, he would be elected president with at least 270 electoral votes. Both candidates' most efficient path is through the Rust Belt. If Biden manages to hold Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, he'll hit exactly 270 electoral votes. Conversely, if Trump manages to flip these 3 back into his column, as he did in 2016, he would hit 279. So you can bet that these 6 states, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, are circled in big red ink at the RNC and DNC headquarters at this very moment. Both sides will surely empty their ginormous fundraising war chests into the ground game and advertisements here. Remember as well that the margins in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin were each less than 1% in 2020, with a total of less than 43,000 votes separating Biden and Trump in these states out of more than 11 million cast and 160 million across the entire country. Had Trump persuaded those 43,000 voters to back him instead of Biden, he would be serving a second term right now. That's how close 2020 was, and the 2024 election may be even closer. And so with that said, let's get into my personal predictions for the outcomes in these contests. Remember, while I am keeping current polling data in mind, these predictions are not dated to if this election were held today. They're based on how I believe the election on November 5th, 2024 will turn out. Starting in Nevada, there are numerous positive indicators for Republicans here, even as Democrats have dominated statewide elections since Barack Obama's 13-point victory in 2008. Nevada has shifted 5 points in favor of Republicans relative to the nation since 2012 and ranks 44th out of the 50 U.S. states in terms of the proportion of residents with a college degree. That's the lowest of any Biden-won state in 2020, and Biden's 2.4-point win 4 years ago was identical to Clinton's 2.4-point win in 2016, which means that Nevada actually trended to the right compared to the nation at large, considering that Biden won the national popular votes by a much wider margin than Clinton did. And more recently, the GOP won a closely contested race for governor in 2022, flipping it from blue to red, and came within a point of defeating a relatively popular Democratic incumbent senator in that election as well. Furthermore, Republicans won the statewide House popular votes in those midterms for the first time in decades. And in terms of current polling trends, no state has been a more positive sign for the Trump campaign than in Nevada, where he currently leads by 4.6% based on 27 polls in the DDHQ and the Hill average. It's a lead that he has held since last December, with 3 of the last 5 polls added to the average, showing him in front by either 7 or 8 points. Now, obviously, I don't actually think that Trump will end up winning Nevada by that much. Even just a Trump plus 4-point victory would be a 6-point swing from Biden plus 2 in 2020, which would be unheard of in a key swing state from one election to another. However, I do believe that 2024 is the year that Nevada finally makes its move towards the GOP at the presidential level. I actually think that Republicans have an opportunity to secure a victory in Nevada by an even larger margin than in many of the states that Biden won by a narrower margin in 2020. Somewhere around 1.5 to 3 points would be my best estimate right now, and that's why Nevada goes down as tilt Republican. And keeping that in mind, our next state is Arizona, where the GOP had reigned supreme at the presidential level for generations, beginning with Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 and ending with Trump in 2016. Republican presidential candidates carried Arizona in 16 out of 17 presidential elections. However, their dominance began to show cracks at the start of the 21st century, and over the last 24 years or so, Arizona has rapidly trended towards the political center in American politics, culminating in a narrow Biden victory in 2020, which was driven by the Republican Party's eroding support among college-educated white voters, rising turnout from Latinos and Native Americans, and the explosive population growth and diversification of Phoenix, the fastest-growing metro area in the entire country. Much like Clark County encompassing the Las Vegas metro area in Nevada, Maricopa County encompassing Phoenix in Arizona is the single biggest factor in determining statewide elections here, as it contains about 2/3 of Arizona's population. Biden became the first Democrat to receive the most votes in Maricopa since 1952, in the split 50.3% to 48.1%, and Biden's raw vote lead of 45,000 votes was just enough to overcome the slight Republican edge across the rest of the state to help Biden win by 11,000 votes in Arizona, 49.4% to 49.1%, carrying its 11 electoral votes. Looking ahead to 2024 now, though, the polling trends in Arizona and Nevada have mirrored each other closely. Trump's current lead is an average of 5.8% based on 39 polls, another impressive-looking performance for the former president in Arizona. But as is the case everywhere, in my opinion, these polls can only tell us so much this far out from Election Day. In Arizona specifically, I get the feeling that the 2024 race will ultimately become a unique test, not necessarily for the two candidates, but rather voter opinion between two hotly contested issues: immigration and abortion rights. Border crossings into Arizona are at record highs, and significant criticism has been sent by officials towards the Biden administration on the issue. Meanwhile, a court ruling earlier this month in Arizona revived an abortion ban from 1864. The Republican-led state legislature did just recently vote to repeal the ban, but not before Democrats could make a significant issue out of it. So while Trump and the Republican Party will make every attempt to frame the 2024 race on the issue of immigration, the Biden campaign will look to make it all about abortion. We'll see how it plays out. For now, I have Arizona following Nevada's suit as a tilt Republican state, as the polling data here is just too strong for Trump and the fundamentals too weak for Democrats not to give the former president a slight edge. Now moving all the way across the Sun Belt to Georgia, another state that Biden won by a very narrow margin in 2020, 0.2%, with a raw vote margin of less than 12,000 votes. Yet once again, Trump is polling very well in Georgia. His current lead over Biden by 3.2% based on 32 polls is actually the narrowest it has been since last October, as Trump had previously led by around 5 points throughout April. Georgia, like Arizona, has shifted strongly towards Democrats over the last decade at the presidential level, going from Romney plus 8 in 2012 to Trump plus 5 in 2016, and then Biden plus 0.2 in 2020. But it is still a very competitive state with strongly conservative roots, one in which incumbent Democrat Raphael Warnock was recently forced into a runoff in the 2022 midterms against Herschel Walker, objectively one of the weakest Republican Senate candidates in a very long time. So while Biden's breakthrough in 2020 and the Democrats' subsequent victories in the Senate in January of 2021 were no doubt significant, the tides right now do seem to be turning back to Trump in Georgia, as betting market odds do give the former president a 57% chance of winning right now, his best odds in any of the 6 key states. I've also got Georgia tilting towards Trump here as well. That leaves us with the absolutely critical Rust Belt trio of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And as you can see in the updated electoral college counts in the race to 270 electoral votes, even if Trump sweeps the key Sunbelt states as he has here, he still only reaches 268 electoral votes, meaning that if Biden can hold on to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the 3 states he's been polling the best in so far this cycle, he would still win re-election with exactly 270 electoral votes. Isn't it interesting how history can repeat itself? Remember that had Hillary Clinton held these 3 states in the Democratic column in 2016, she would have defeated Trump. And had Trump held them in his corner in 2020, he would have won a second term. I do generally tend to analyze Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania as a trio because their voting history and demographic profiles are so similar. Historically speaking, this trio can be considered ancestrally Democratic due to the strong presence of white working-class voters that had previously made up the backbone of the Democratic electorate for most of the late 20th century. They had voted Democratic in 6 straight elections between 1988 to 2016, when Trump narrowly flipped them into his column due to his and the Republican Party's emerging appeal among non-college educated white voters in this region, the same appeal that made previous swing states in the Midwest like Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, and Missouri all go from Obama-era battlegrounds to now reliably Republican. This upper Rust Belt trio, though, did flip back in favor of Democrats in 2020, due mostly to aversion to Trump among college-educated voters in the region, especially suburban women. Demographically speaking, they each rank very closely in terms of racial diversity and educational attainment. Wisconsin is the 20th whitest and 33rd most educated, while Pennsylvania ranks 19th and 24th in those categories, respectively. Now, in 2024, it's truly anyone's guess as to how they will vote next. On the one hand, widespread backlash against the Supreme Court's decision to strike down Roe v. Wade has helped the Democratic Party exceed expectations up and down the ballot in key races in 2022 and 2023. They swept the governor's races in all 3 states in the 2022 midterms and significantly outperformed polling expectations in several down-ballot Senate and House races as well. Perhaps most notably, though, a highly politicized Supreme Court election in Wisconsin in 2023 that almost entirely revolved around abortion rights went the liberal justices' way by 11 points. On the other hand, a large majority of voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania still hold very negative views on the state of the economy, according to public polling data, and history shows that incumbent presidents' re-election odds are heavily tied to how voters feel about their own personal financial situations at the time of the election. The economy has always topped voters' key issues, especially in this part of the country. So in order for Biden to hold on to these states, he will need voters' economic outlooks to improve quickly. All of that being said, top-line polling data in these 3 states has generally trended more positive for Biden, at least compared to the Sun Belt, although he still does trail Trump in all 3 states. Starting in Wisconsin, Trump leads Biden by 3.1% based on 30 polls, but this is the former president's largest margin of lead here since January. The polls had consistently showed Trump leading by just about a point or 2 at best for most of February, March, and April. Over in Michigan, Trump's overall lead is very similar at 3.3% based on 45 polls, though 3 of the last 5 polls added to this average, 3 of the most recent, have shown Biden leading. If it weren't for this outlier poll from Kaplan Strategies at Trump plus 15, Biden could very well be polling within a point of Trump in this average in Michigan right now. Finally, in Pennsylvania, Trump's narrowest margin of lead out of these 3 states, it's less than a point right now. In fact, it's 0.7% based on 46 polls. This lead has flipped back and forth here over the last several weeks, as you see here, with neither candidate holding an advantage of more than 1% since mid-March. Now returning to the map, in my personal view, I actually believe that Biden's best odds are in Michigan. He won by 3 points here in 2020 compared to just a point in Pennsylvania and closer to half a point in Wisconsin, and Democrats have generally performed best in elections in Michigan over the last 5 years or so. While there is a substantial Muslim population in Michigan, with some analysts suggesting that Biden is losing support due to his handling of the conflict in the Middle East, I'm unsure how tangible that effect will be when all is said and done. It could certainly lead Michigan to vote to the right of Pennsylvania and maybe even Wisconsin, but I can't say that I have been convinced enough to shift my priors here. Currently, I have Michigan as tilt Democrat, supported by those priors, and the fact that polling trends have shown Biden with the most momentum out of these states in Michigan. Pennsylvania, on the other hand, in my estimation, falls into the toss-up category. Biden has consistently polled the best in his home state compared to the rest of these battlegrounds, where his campaign has also focused a lot of attention and where Democrats have overperformed their expected margins in recent elections. Most recently, John Fetterman winning 2022's open U.S. Senate race in Pennsylvania by 5 points over Dr. Oz, despite trailing in the polls headed into the election. On the other hand, I consider Wisconsin the least likely to support Biden. He only carried the state by 0.6% and 20,000 votes in 2020, and it has been decided by less than a point in 4 out of the last 6 elections. In fact, the last 4 elections without Obama on the ballot in Wisconsin were all decided by less than 1%, and it has voted to the right of Michigan and Pennsylvania in all 4 of those elections. Moreover, its demographics are more favorable to Republicans than the other 2 states. It's both whiter and less college-educated than, for example, Nebraska. It is intriguing, though, that betting markets seem the most bullish on Biden's chances in Wisconsin, currently giving him the best odds here out of all 3. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that. I recognize that polls were relatively favorable for him for a while here, but the fundamentals are just simply less pro-Biden than in Michigan or Pennsylvania. And this far out from the election, those fundamentals simply take more precedence in my mind. It's also worth noting that polls have actually underestimated Trump in Wisconsin more than in any other key battleground states. For instance, in 2016, Clinton led by 6.5 points in the final polling average, only to end up losing by a point. And then in 2020, Biden led by 8.5% headed into Election Day and ended up winning by less than 1%. Ultimately, I have Wisconsin tilting towards Trump on this map, completing this update. Donald Trump is projected to win the presidency with 278 electoral votes over Joe Biden's 241, with 19 electoral votes in Pennsylvania in the toss-up category. Now, this is an extremely narrow margin that ultimately hinges on the many unknowns surrounding this rematch. We simply can't say for sure right now whether Biden's poor polling numbers against Trump are because people are actually dissatisfied with his candidacy, not necessarily that they would vote for Trump over him this time around, or whether they have actually been turned off by him enough to switch their votes in favor of Trump just 4 years after these 2 candidates met for the first time. I also think it's fair to say that while Biden is the most unpopular incumbent running for re-election in modern history, Donald Trump is broadly unpopular as well. So as voters make their final decisions closer to Election Day, they'll be faced with the unique situation of evaluating a Biden presidency against a Trump presidency, rather than a Biden presidency against a fresh new Republican face. Anyways, that does it for this 2024 presidential election map prediction and analysis. Let me know whether you agree or disagree with these ratings in the comment section below. Shout out to my channel members on screen here. Thank you so much for your support. If you would like to become a member, go ahead and click the join button below this video to receive exclusive perks. Make sure also to check out electionpredictionsofficial.com for my latest 2024 forecast. Subscribe while you're down there and like the video if you did. You can check out more content from my channel here. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. EP out.